So, welcome everybody. Just wanting to check the clock. Are we on Harvard time? So like about 5 minutes late? Okay, we're 3 minutes late, but we might as well. Like we're. So we'll get started now to make sure we get time. So I'm Tom Kane. I'm faculty director of the PIER program in the Center for Education Policy Research. I'm glad to welcome you here today to hear from Tom D. So there's a group of folks who are joining us online, and for those folks, I would encourage you to email Ashley Dixon if you have questions at the end. Otherwise, we're good for the folks who are present. We will ask questions, what has become known as econ style, which means, in the moment. And we'll save at least 15 minutes for a discussion at the end. But if you have questions as we go through, please feel free to ask. And then if it gets out of hand, and Tom is not making progress, I may put an end to that or have us move along. Remember, this session is being recorded, so please keep that in mind when you choose how you word your questions. Now, I just want to give a warm welcome to Tom D. Tom is the Barnett Family Professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. He's also faculty director of the John W. Gardner Center for Youth and their communities. His research is focused on quantitative methods, in particular program evaluations for important questions of public policy. So Tom received the Peter Rossi Award for contributions to the theory and practice of program evaluation in 2024 from APAM. So we're lucky to have Tom join us today. And this is the last of the PIER seminars this year, believe it or not. So we're closing out strong with Tom. But I mention that because we'll be putting together the list of seminars for next summer, for next year. Over the summer, we'll be inviting folks for next year. So if you have ideas and requests, please send them to me and Ashley Dixon. All right. So thank you, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And thank you, folks, for having me. I just really enjoyed being in conversation with you today and the opportunity to be here. And I appreciate the forewarning about econ style. Since I'm become a fan of, I just finished season 2 of Severance. I was thinking I'll manage the 4 tempers by Keir here. And I think we'll all get through it. So this is work I want to stress joint with Liz Huffaker. If you don't know Liz, she's definitely worth getting to know. Really fabulous early career scholar, recent graduate of our doctoral program. She's postdocing with me and Susanna Loeb right now before heading off to the University of Florida in the fall. And this work is also partnership research, so there's some elements of that we may want to surface in our discussion, and I'll certainly reference a few. But before I get into the typical motivation for this talk, I wanted to provide a sort of higher level one, because one of the things that I think has been motivating a great deal of my research recently are what are the practical things we can do to get kids in front of appropriately rich academic content, and to get them in front of also really high quality instruction. And so that's, you'll often hear people say, and I may have said in the past and maybe even said it here, that this idea of curriculum is the low-hanging fruit of education reform. But of course, we know that's far too simplistic. Simply adopting a textbook or a new curriculum is a far leap from having teachers actually change their practice in meaningful ways that support the academic potential in kids. And so those kinds of issues around the practicalities have informed work and the possibilities of pedagogy and the kinds of courses students take have motivated not just the math work I'm going to describe today, but recent work I've been doing on helping teachers reshape their early literacy practices in elementary schools in ways aligned with the science of reading. A body of research I'm continuing to pursue around different instantiations of culturally relevant pedagogy and the effects that has on students. And I could talk a little bit about some of the mediation that I think might be going on there, which I think is poorly understood. And also I've been doing work recently, for example, on a paper coming out this week on AP Computer Science, using data from high schools right here in Massachusetts, and where I find that my co-author and I, a graduate student at Stanford, find that offering the new AP Computer Science course that was introduced about a decade ago seems to have been a rare sort of good news story about education research and practice. Substantially increased take-up of AP Computer Science, did not crowd out the pre-existing CSA, diversified students who were participating in it, and maybe even created some knock-on benefits in other courses. But again, I just want to draw this kind of meta motivation to the math research I'm going to be talking about, that what courses students are taking, how those courses are being taught, et cetera, I see as particularly propitious opportunities for realizing student excellence and promoting positive change. And also see this as distinct from things and work I've done previously that have been more accountability incentives, output-based policies, et cetera. Okay, so let's get into a more conventional motivation, which begins with things like pointing out, math matters. Success in high school mathematics is pretty uncontroversially recognized as relevant for a variety of outcomes. And I want to stress, too, uniquely relevant at this historical moment in education recovery from the pandemic. Math, at least until the most recent round of certain NAEP scores, but seems to be an area where pandemic learning loss has been particularly severe. We saw that, for example, in the PISA data that were released last December. That was a particularly sobering moment for us as a nation, I think, seeing not just how we've done in absolute levels, but in kind of league tables with other countries. And so not only do we know math matters, we know we're not necessarily realizing where we want to be with that, but we also know there are real equity problems with regard to math excellence. Enrollment in advanced math is highly stratified along multiple dimensions, not just across, but even within schools. Right? So this is all pretty well known, but I really want to zero in on the question of when and with whom specific math courses, particularly Algebra I, are taken, is very highly contested in research and policy. And I'll say I thought through prior research on things like NCLB or Michelle Rhee's teacher assessment reforms in Washington, D.C., I thought I knew what a controversial topic was in education, or even ethnic studies in California. All potentially highly, but I felt nothing like the kind of sense of parental angst that nothing has contrasted quite as much as what I've experienced here. And I think this speaks to something specific about math. It touches on our most kind of brainstem sense of our desires for our kids, our sense of fairness, our questions of notions of meritocracy and equality of opportunity are all kind of blended together when it comes to math and in particular algebra in a way no other topic is. Yes, Peter.
Is this also going to touch on whether these classes are taught? Because I know in California there are the math wars around whether we should be teaching algebra or data science.
Yeah, so there you might be thinking of Algebra II rather than algebra, but I am going to talk specifically about California because not just algebra, but California is very much at the center of the current iteration of the math wars. So there's just 3 headlines, and I believe these were all from the same week in the New York Times, right? And some of these reference some of the work I'm going to be talking about today, but also specifically what's been going on in California has been a source of controversy here. And the partnership we've been doing has played some role in this. So let me give you just a really brief and necessarily kind of crass and reductive walk through what's been going on with Algebra I policymaking. And I frame this as from pillar to post, because 20 plus, I mean, it used to be in the distant past, we didn't necessarily expect kids to be taking algebra, till high school. It began to seep into middle school. And then 20 plus years ago, there's a sense of, well, this is one of the ways in which schools are reproducing inequality. And that motivated the Algebra All-For movement. Again, it was framed largely as a civil rights issue. Everyone should have access to this academically rich instruction, in a similarly soon way. And so that led to acceleration, by which I mean wide or even universal middle school access to algebra. Again, framed as a solution to this within-school sorting problem. And you could see this in data from California, for example. The share of 8th graders in Algebra I grew from 16% to nearly 2 out of 3 in relatively short order. The evidence suggests the acceleration benefited students who were well prepared to head into algebra, but had negative consequences for lower performing students. Okay, so what happened after that? Well, we moved from Algebra for All to what I somewhat glibly and perhaps unfairly call Algebra for None. And this was spearheaded in one of our partner districts, San Francisco, in 2014 began a process of deceleration in math and detracking algebra, that it was embedded in its Common Core transition. And so in particular, this was the key graph, the math pathways that were set up in San Francisco as they began offering this Common Core sequence in math for everyone. They pushed Algebra for All to 9th grade and even kept kids, the first intent was to keep them in the same course through 10th grade. And only in 11th grade would you see some different pathways where some kids could go off to this Common Core Algebra 2 pre-calc compression course the district created. Some could just take Algebra 2, and the idea was that this would be all things to all people. The superintendent at the time, Richard Carranza, said, we're the innovators, we're ahead of the game, which became the title of our paper on this. We're leading for others in this. We're gonna sort of create equity in these math pathways without harming any kids in the process. Now, as this was going on, the state, and Peter, this may be some of what you were talking about, was beginning debate over the recently adopted California math framework, which is state-level guidance to districts about how they should think about designing, what courses to teach, how to design pathways, et cetera. And in the wake of this, you've seen, and during the Common Core transition, California districts have gone in different directions. Some have gone into the more international model of integrated math sequences, and Liz has done some of her independent dissertation work, has been on that topic. So what were the effects of this? So where, arguably the concern here is that by delaying kids from taking algebra at some level, you're lowering the ceiling, not raising the floor. And I want to say more about the math framework, but let me go to Dan first. Yeah. Well, I think I should know this, but I don't. The graduation requirements, I think, would have kept them in math at least through 10th grade, but I would have to double check that. But I'm going to show you what happens to course taking among these cohorts overall. So I do want to step back to this math framework, though, because this is a situation where I feel as if I should know more and I don't, because, San Francisco's reform, to say it was controversial would be an understatement. Parents became really upset about this, to the point where I have a Stanford colleague who was advising the district on this reform. And when I came out with the paper I'm going to show you that suggested the reform wasn't working, there was such confused anger in the public that I was getting attacked as if I had been supporting the reform. I mean, there was just such reflexive anger and concern about this. Okay, and this is where with Liz Huffaker and another Stanford student, Sarah Novikov, we thought we can do some really helpful partnership research. That's fundamentally just descriptive, but part of what was going on in the debate is people were not even arguing from the same set of facts. parents were making certain criticisms about what they were seeing in the publicly available data, and the district was using its own way of cutting the data to suggest, no, this is actually working pretty well. So we decided we could make a useful contribution to this by coming in independently and doing an exhaustive and very transparent analysis of what was going on with course-taking pathways. Before I show you what we found, though, one quick aside. This math framework is, to this day, I don't understand what's going on with this, because as the San Francisco controversy was roiling, the math framework was being debated and instantiated, and initially embraced this reform, saying everyone statewide should delay algebra. But then as the pushback grew, they kind of rolled it back. And so now when I read that math framework, even with a kind of Talmudic eye, I'm not sure what I'm seeing, because it seems to have language that could be understood as endorsing this, but kind of not, so it became a very, to my eye, a kind of equivocating document. Okay, so what happened in San Francisco? Yeah, yes, Peter.
Can you talk a little about the political economy of pushing through a reform that ended up in equilibrium being so controversial?
Yeah, so I think it had, one of the things, and this might be wrong of me, so I'm not a close student of the political economy, but one of the things I worry about when I think of this is the superintendent turnstile. The superintendent at the time, in 2014, touted this as wonderful and was gone within a year. And by the time this policy was rescinded, it had probably been through 3 or 4 superintendentships, last one in New York City. And so I think I worry there's something careerist about that superintendent turnstile that doesn't complement good policymaking. The district staff with whom I work closely, they're well-intentioned. They're not out, they really believe what they were doing would work, and they had some researchers telling them it would work. And the parents were, like many voters, even though they had strong internal interest, fairly low information and not forward-looking in this process. So that's how it could become a kind of logistical operational reality before parents knew. But once they began to understand, the rollback was quick and has continued to roil the district and board elections and things of that sort. So that's my thumbnail, that mix of superintendent turnstile, low information voters, and well-intentioned staff making the foolish mistake of listening to academics. But let me show you what happened, because we're not even onto the main part of the talk yet. So first of all, first stage impact of this reform looked pretty substantial. One of the things we did that was useful is people who were looking at the data were looking at what percentage of students are taking this course in this year. But the reform was cohort defined. The graduation cohorts 16, 17, and 18 were not subject to the reform. The 19, 20, 21 cohorts were. So we built longitudinal profiles by cohort, not by academic year of course taking, to look at summative status measures for course taking, which gives us a crisper sense of what's going on here. And so we could see as we go from the pre-reform cohorts to the post-reform cohorts, before the reform, this black line, under 40% of students are taking algebra in 9th grade. When they had to take it later, it jumped to 90% or so. 50% of kids were taking geometry in 9th grade. That fell dramatically because it was getting pushed to 10th grade now. So really substantial inframarginal effects on this take-up. Now, it's not complete, and you see some clawback here. So what was going on is there's one very particular high-performing, or selective high school in San Francisco, Lowell, if those of you know the system, where they allowed some kids to double up on algebra and geometry in 9th grade, and other schools began allowing kids to do that in 10th grade, and other students found other ways to kind of advance on this a little bit. So you see a little bit of drop here, a little bit of catch up there. But the point here is there was a really substantial change in course pathways with this. This is just descriptive conditional means in a time series, nothing causally sophisticated here. I was presenting this once at a conference. I was like, no complicated quasi-experimental design here. This is just descriptive stuff. I was like, but when you see changes this big, I joked it has a causal flavor, right? Even I would admit that. And then every speaker after me said, my results too have a causal flavor, like that. So, okay, we have lots of different cuts of the data. This paper is just out in Ed Researcher if you want to see it. Let me show you the one graph that I think most people care about as we look to capstone outcomes, which is taking calculus. Okay, and so what we could see here, the diamond line here is all students. We see a drop of something like 5 to 6 percentage points. It was particularly concentrated among Asian American and Pacific Islander students. Big drop in take-up of calculus. And you also see them kind of some clawback over time. And no real closure of the gap between Black and Hispanic students and other students in take-up of these courses. So again, lots of other cuts of the data looking at different things. I think the main point I want to make here is that this approach to detracking, this kind of leveling down to create equity, arguably didn't even achieve on its own terms in terms of course-taking patterns. And so, if we were to take a straight line through the kind of failures of algebra for all and the apparent failures of algebra for none, it suggests to me a kind of design tension that is frustrating, that, policies of detracking through acceleration or deceleration alone suggest the only way we can promote equity in math course taking is through leveling down, not up. Now, if you're a strong form Rawlsian, like that might be appealing, but I think many people, feel a little uncomfortable with that approach. Yes? Oh, okay, sorry. I guess part of the motivating point for the partnership research I want to discuss today is if we think about this frame on the debate, I want to notice that it's placing far less emphasis on what actually goes on within these classrooms. It's what course you're taking, but not really about what's happening within those courses, what's happening with instruction. And that's a leaping off point here. And part of the reason we might think this matters is that, there's some evidence, for example, good evidence that additional instructional time, the so-called double dose studies, though they're expensive to provide that additional instructional time, they seem effective in protecting low-performing students in algebra classes from the potential academic harm of acceleration. So in light of all this, the motivating question here is, can supporting teacher pedagogy in detrack classes also address this excellence equity design tension that appears to exist in the kind of reductive way we've framed the debate here? And because you're doing it without adding a whole extra period of instructional time, rather merely through refashioning what teachers are already doing, is there a potential to do it at lower cost? Okay, so part of this, brings us into the space of instructional differentiation. And so if you're not familiar with this, there's some evidence that when teachers face, homogeneous groups, there's some benefits from that. And the theory of this is that teachers are better able to engage in instructional targeting. Teaching to the middle becomes this, much wanted teaching at the speed of learning, okay? But this requires teacher craft, I think, of a particularly high order. Achieving instructional targeting in detract mixed achievement classrooms is, challenging for teachers. But the promise is also alluring too. If teachers can engage in an effective instructional differentiation, it allows us to realize the potential benefits of detracking without the harm and without necessarily the cost of instructional time. Now, I also want to add, there's a lot of literature on instructional differentiation, but the characterizations we have seen of it have been that it's not entirely a clear literature. First of all, what do people mean by instructional differentiation is not entirely clear. So-called definitional inconsistencies. Is instructional differentiation, hey, I'm going to divide this class. We're going to have a gold group, a silver group, and a brown group, right? And let's all segregate. That's just creating detracking within or tracking within a detrack class. Sometimes when people are thinking of instructional differentiation, it's about, teachers making thoughtful real-time use of formative assessments and then, responding to that in some way. What I'm going to describe in this intervention is, I think, something more compelling and nuanced in terms of instructional differentiation. It's about the practices teachers actually have on a day-to-day basis in the classroom, okay? So let's move towards that. So let me say a little bit about this partnership study. We call it the Algebra I Initiative. It occurred in 4 high schools in the Sequoia Union High School District. We have 2 major standing research partnerships, practitioner partnerships at Stanford, the Stanford SFUSD partnership and the Stanford Sequoia K-12 Research Collaborative. And so this is a product of the second one. And I like to stress, this is very much a field-generated question. This grew out of a lot of concern within the district about how well they were serving, in particular, kids who were deemed so far below grade level that they weren't being allowed to take algebra in 9th grade. And this is a high school district, so they're not dealing with the kids at the elementary school level. And they were concerned that it's so hard to get many of these kids on a sort of college and career-ready path if they're not even in a position to take algebra till 10th grade. So it was their problem of practice that motivated us, and they came to us with their idea of a solution and even the research design, right? How often does this happen, right? Where the practitioner came to us like, well, we've been confronting this, and we thought what I'm going to describe would be a good solution, and we really wanted to know whether it would work. So we set up some pilot classes and randomly assigned students. So it always makes me think there's a line from one of my favorite writers where he refers to, sometimes you feel like the favorite son of a benevolent providence. And that's what I felt like here. Go ahead, Tom.
Tom, just to point out, this is a different solution to the political problem in that rather than, make a huge bet on shifting the whole district to this strategy.
Yeah.
A lot of evidence beforehand to suggest that was going to have a big positive effect. Instead, they said, okay, we think this is going to work. We hope this is going to work. Let's set up a study to see whether it works. And then, depending on what we see, we'll have the evidence to respond to the critics.
Yeah.
The parent critics. It's not just like an empirical design. It's a different political.
Yeah. But I want to stress, though, it most definitely was not all rainbows and unicorns. Like part of the reason the district wanted to do the study is there were people sitting on the school board and parents in the community who were saying things like, I don't want my kids in a class with those kids, kind of thing. And so I think part of the political economy of doing this partnership research and why some practitioners see value is not just our idealized notion of being a learning organization, which can be there and is important, but it's also, they hope it can be a kind of political Teflon. Which is okay. But definitely that's there. So again, as I already intimated, what this initiative did was accelerated into Algebra I, rising 9th graders who were labeled below grade level, well below grade level. And their business as usual condition is a course they called Algebra Readiness, which was a kind of remedial course for kids to take before they would take algebra. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the teachers of this initiative because, of course, we're all going to be worried about confounds and internal validity. So trust me, we'll sweat that a little bit. But the initiatives, the key thing is wasn't just the detracking and targeted acceleration. It was coupled with unique instructional supports, professional development, coaching, and some resources, an extra planning period, and a professional learning community. And I'm going to say more about this. I want to give you more granularity for what this actually is. And that might actually be my next slide. So when I was talking about instructional differentiation here, it's really, was there a question? I'm sorry.
I'm wondering how below grade level is defined and decided.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you asked that question. They used baseline assessments. I should remember all of them. Definitely the state SBAC.
At the end of 8th grade or at the beginning of grade?
No, it's at the end of 7th grade. And I've since been finding out more about this, and this is a non-unified district, so it's a high school district. So one of the things I've learned, and other high school districts might do this too, there's a data exchange with the feeder elementary school districts. They don't get the data from them in time. They could go into the state longitudinal data system, type in the student's name, and get the 8th grade assessment, but they wait. Some districts will do this. They'll wait to do so until October, because the moment they type the student's name in, it's part of their graduation cohort. So to you see what's going on here, to game the high school graduation rate, they don't want to claim ownership of the student until they know they're stable in the enrollment. So I'm going to work with them on this, because we should not live in this world where everything you do in 8th grade has no implication for your placement. And I wonder how many other non-unified districts have this practice. Sorry, was there another? Yes.
Because it seems that like 9th grade is a little bit late to like actually intervene if they're already behind grade level. Yeah.
Well, and other than their kind of moral suasion, they don't even have these students till then, because it's a high school district. It's so they can't do reforms in earlier grades. Though we do have joint partnership meetings, so I'm hoping as this relationship evolves, there'll be opportunities to sort of think cohesively about these student pathways. By the way, I think I've got it on a later slide, but this is some of the characteristics of this district. But let me say a little bit first about just what they did for these teachers and what was the nature of instructional differentiation. One of the first phrases they use as a kind of an omnibus for a couple things is the idea of math language routines. And I heard this phrase from them quite a bit. An initiative class should look and sound different to a conventional algebra course. And some of this is high expectations and math identity. So, you belong in algebra, you're going to go on to geometry. So there's a bit of like growth mindset elements to that. But another critical part involves pacing. So the conventional algebra curriculum is pretty tightly structured in terms of what we're doing this week and the next week and the next week. Teachers are given a little more autonomy here for responsive pacing. But also to kind of stay on the marks to some extent, the learning is centered around monthly common problems. And this is one of the things, again, I'm not a curriculum or instruction person, but I thought this was interesting. There was a lot of intentionality in the exact math problems they would choose. So trying to choose ones that had a kind of capaciousness to them that would create learning opportunities for students who were coming in with higher levels of achievement and students who had further to go to catch up with them. And so really intentional problem selection, so there was a richness to them that could carry everyone along and give them learning opportunities. And of course, time and money, which we all know matters, right? Extra prep period with a campus partner, monthly full-day release, and some lesson studies, a professional learning community, and an outside coach. I think it was the Silicon Valley Math Foundation was their partner in this. So this is basically what's been going on, this mix of kind of classroom reforms and time. And some of these like time and money issues will come back when I talk about, are embedded in the cost effectiveness calculations I want to show you. Okay, so basics of the random assignment that they did for us. So they had these baseline achievement designations based on 7th grade scores. So everyone, and the counterfactual differs for each of these three groups. The treatment experience is the same. It's Algebra I with initiative pedagogy and this change in peers, right? Because the composition of the class is changing. So for the group that was at grade level, this was relative to just a conventional regular algebra course. Notably, this nearly at grade level group has a kind of more vexed and hard to understand treatment and control contrast, because they had the regular Algebra I, but they also had a kind of double dose support class that they lost if they moved into this. So that's a little harder to understand. And then at some level, the focal group is this algebra readiness group that of course, was in here and if randomly assigned to the control, and here if in the treatment. So that's the basic design. And I'll talk more about the basic intent to treat specification I use, but let me also give you a little bit more about the district in the Bay Area. Medium size, oh, go ahead, Eric.
One more design question.
Sure.
How many teachers provided the treatment condition? Like how many?
Yeah, I think it's at the bottom of this slide. I think I want to say it's 8.
And how were they selected?
Yeah, I've got that on the next slide too. And basically, they were voluntold, to use that term of art. And of course, one of the concerns, sensible concern, I'm sure you and others are thinking of is, are these teachers just better or different in some way? And so we do some things to look at their traits, and both their description of how they did the assignment and everything we could see, or virtually everything we could see about the teachers, suggests that's not what's going on here. Now, the other thing, while I'm sharing things, potential threats to the interpretation of this study that we can't address well, we've got random assignment to the classes versus not, and the treatment, as I'm stressing, is not just detracking, it's detracking plus instructional supports. But I can't answer the counterfactual, what would have happened if we just put these kids in regular algebra without the instructional support? And for these kids, this targeted group in this particular context, I can't answer that question. But what I do say on a later slide is everything we know from Algebra for All suggests it wouldn't have gone well. Yeah.
One thing you might be able to do, though, is estimate value added for these teachers in a pre-period. And just answer the question, just based on that, how much of the treatment effect would we have?
Yeah, so this is, all sobering truths bared here. This is exactly the problem I had in the ethnic studies research in San Francisco, where it was a small-scale pilot, nice RD design, seemed to be huge effects, but it was a small number of teachers. And so I was worried, is it the class or are these just better teachers? And these were teachers who were carefully trained and highly motivated to teach that class. So I was able to do exactly that because they taught other social studies classes along with other teachers and was able to form value added and do sort of non-parametric tests and leave one out exercises and things of that sort. We weren't able to do that here because of I think it was the testing regime change and the testing by grade. I think that, the intersection of all those just made it impossible for us to do the value-added component, but every other teacher observable we consider. And we also, I think, do leave one out exercises to see if there's high leverage off any one of the teachers. So, that along with all the anecdote about who these teachers were gives us some reasonable confidence that it's not some capricious imbalance of unobserved teacher effectiveness. But it's, of course, not, as with all things, never totally definitive. So again, just quickly about the district. In the Bay Area, medium size, 40% of students are economically disadvantaged. It's demographically diverse. I do want to stress for a moment, I can't stress enough how the socioeconomic gradient in this district is steeper than probably any district in the nation. This area includes some of the most economically distressed areas in the Bay Area and some of the wealthiest places in the country, right? Like houses that cost tens, if not $100 million are in this district. So really unusual place. Has all the problems you might expect in terms of stratification of math scores and course taking. So for example, over 75% of white and Asian students met the University of California admission requirements. Fewer than half of Black and Hispanic students did. And again, the district identified this grade 9 placement as a problem. Oh, mentioning the UC reminded me of something I wanted to say about the San Francisco experiment. They created that compression course. This goes to your political economy issue too. The UC system wouldn't accept it. The UC system looked at that Algebra II pre-calc compression course and said, no way, this does not meet our standards. So that became another part of the roiling debate. And the UC is a big player in these sorts of K through 12 policy decisions in California. And they were having a role in the debate around ethnic studies, for example. Okay, So our experiment is situated among fall 2019 ninth graders entering the district. Nothing unusual happened in that year, so we'll just trip lightly over that. Yes?
So a couple of questions going back to the issue of like sort of the gaming that this district seems to do with whether or not to look at a kid's record. First question is, how does the treatment group look relative to the rest of the district? And second, should we look at the students that were already at the school as like a selected population, or just?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the vast majority of these students were coming up through the feeder districts. There are a few, I'm gonna give you a more detailed description of the intent to treat sample. There are a few categories like newcomer English learner students and people for whom they don't have the placement information that are left out. There was another component to your question that I know I got at, so I wanted to.
Yeah, it's basically like a balance analysis of the students.
Yeah, how they're different. So this is important, in particular for the political economy in which the district consumed this, is the only students in this intent to treat sample were those at grade level, just below, and then this focal group that is quite well below. The students who were above grade level generally are students who took algebra in 8th grade. They're in geometry in 9th grade. They're not part of this experiment at all. And, it's an anecdote about doing partnership research. When we were, writing up our study, of course, we're engaged in long, languorous, sense-making conversations with our partners. And somewhere deep in the middle of the paper, we say, hey, these kids who are taking geometry in 9th grade, they're not part of it. As the moment to make the paper public came out, the district people were just like, could you center that element because they're worried about pushback from sort of affluent parents in their district, like, what are you running experiments on the kids and you're doing, et cetera. So there was a point where, they were saying, can you mention it like in the abstract of the paper? That I was like, I have to stop there because it's just not really, I was like, don't worry, no one reads them anyway. Or very few people. So that's another critical part. So anyway, over 1,000 students in the intent to treat population, those at or below grade level. There were some students at a small alternative high school that didn't participate. This goes to your question in more detail. Again, this third that were above grade level are definitely not in it. Some students with IEPs, newcomer English learners, were also ineligible, and those who weren't at a feeder district and didn't have the baseline variable. So there were, across the 4 high schools, 23 of these Algebra Initiative classrooms, 8 unique teachers, 26 regular classes, and 7 Algebra Readiness sections, okay? So let me talk a little bit about pre-registration. So we pre-registered math as our test score outcomes. And I'll mention as a quick aside, I know I've had this conversation with many of you privately. In my quasi-experimental work, I've become increasingly concerned that p-hacking is an undiagnosed problem there. So I've written an essay, it's just out recently, that lays out a case for thinking about adapting pre-registration practices for quasi-experimental settings and adopting them as a new standard of practice. So I've been in some conversations with people about it, and I'm increasingly concerned that it's important both because conceptually it makes sense. There'd be more p-hacking in quasi-experimental research. We have vastly more discretion to, run amok with our motivated reasoning and unconscious biases. And moreover, there's empirical evidence in the distribution of t-statistics from quasi-experimental studies. And I'm really fascinated, I've been telling people about this, there's a cottage industry of so-called many analyst studies where you give different teams of researchers the same data and the same question, and you see a multiplicity of findings. So it's really disturbing to me that's happening. I've begun pre-registering my quasi-experimental studies, but I think it's very much not the norm yet, and how we should think about doing that is uncertain, or many different ways we could think about design features for that. Anyway, for this, we pre-registered math. Initially, we had in mind a kind of short-term early impact study that would focus on the interim comprehensive assessment the students would take in math in 10th grade. We didn't know there were only 11 items on that test. And, you know, we're all doing like many projects. I was like, well, we'll give them a quick answer. Let's just pre-register this. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and everything in our work plan kind of slowed down. And our thought originally was, well, we'll use later outcomes for a subsequent study. We could pre-register that too. But again, since everything slowed down, we folded the grade 11 SBAC, which is the major state assessment, into this analysis. And so we've kind of tacitly folded that into our confirmatory outcomes with some multiple comparison adjustments. And we focus on a bunch of other outcomes: course progression, attendance, retention within the district. But we do want to be straightforward that we pre-registered them as exploratory, not confirmatory. Okay, so, and again, I feel like saying, like, exploratory results matter too. And part of the argument I make for pre-registration of quasi-experiments is that understanding confirmatory and exploratory can dovetail with the kind of Bayesian way we have sense-making around individual study results, that we all kind of like update our priors, and it can just influence the way in which we update priors, okay? There's kind of an irony that we do frequentist statistics, but we're in our work, but we're Bayesian consumers, right, when we sense-make. Okay. So basic ITT framework, really straightforward. We're looking at the interaction of assignment to the condition, interacting with baseline traits, conditional on which baseline your group you're in, with fixed effects for your 9th grade campus when you're entering. So this is for student I, class section C, school S. And this in particular is, I mean, they're all beta 1, 2, and 3 of interest, but this in particular, for this below grade level group, we're clustering standard errors at the grade level. I also do permutation inference. I'm kind of a fan of permutation inference. I know sometimes the experimentalists use it, but I think it makes more sense in quasi-experimental work where there's not a sense in which you have a sample from some hypothesized superpopulation. This is pretty much everyone. So having a design approach to inference as opposed to a sample-based one is conceptually appealing, I think. Yes?
Why are you calling this a quasi-experiment?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not. This is very much an experiment, but because I want to present more than one study, I'm weaving in some other insights and ideas that I think are exciting. I apologize for the confusion.
You're justifying some shenanigans that you'll have later on.
Well, you can tell me if there are shenanigans or even monkey shine later. Yeah.
Do you have like a continuous baseline achievement measure rather than just these categories?
Oh, yeah, we do. And I think we have some, in one of the 12 appendix tables, some results that condition on them, but I'm not 100% certain if I'm recalling that correctly.
They would capture a ton of within.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I believe they're in there, but I'd have to go into the appendix to check. So thank you. And we've also got alternative specifications where we flood this with a variety of other teacher and student level observables. Also, one of the things I think maybe we don't worry about quite enough is the finite sample bias in cluster adjustments. So there's different standards on this, the sort of Angrish-Pischke ones, as if you've got 43 or more, you're probably okay, but some other work has suggested you could have problems with finite sample bias in the cluster adjustment with 100 clusters. So that's one of the things we check along with randomization inference and some multiple comparison corrections. So, okay, so let's get into what some of the internal validity threats, and we've already discussed some of this. I mean, first of all, the randomization balance seems to work well both on student level and the teacher level. Yes, Peter?
So when you're running that regression, you just pool everything. So are you thinking about this as like one experiment or like 3 experiments within one? Or?
One experiment with these 3 different strata in it. So 3 in 1 has a kind of Swiss Army knife feature.
Do you do any analyses where you just like treatment versus like control, in terms of like thinking about this as like the district wanted to do something, and the something was like three things.
Yeah, I haven't, and I guess part of the reason I wouldn't have done that reflexively is I'm always trying to be mindful of what's the counterfactual. And if you go back to that table, the counterfactual is so variegated across these three strata that I think this is maybe the cleaner way to think about it. Because again, for the at grade level, the counterfactual is regular algebra. Yeah.
Because of power issues, or?
Well, it undoubtedly would be underpowered as well, but I think for this coefficient, the stacking probably isn't, generating that much power. It's really more what is the treatment contrast.
I mean, you're not going to get much power at all because of the interaction. But the stack
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. No, not much. I agree.
Although the campus fixed effects are at.
Yeah, I guess you can.
So
Because that's,
But you're assuming stability there, so it's actually interesting, which could suggest that your counterfactual
Stability of the campus fixed effects, you mean?
at grade level
that's
as interactive, it means that you're completely pooling the campus fixed effects for your three groups,
right.
which would give you power, but
Yeah.
would give you potential bias.
Exactly. So I think, yeah, because that to me, it feels like
Right.
if you're running one regression, I would want to see it just as like treatment versus control if you're running it with these interactions, Luke was mentioning the campus.
Sorry, I want to make sure I'm understanding. Which interactions are you talking about? Campus with?
Nearly and below.
I see. Okay.
Because your beta one,
Yeah.
ideally you're comparing treated at grade level to untreated at grade level.
Yeah. So these.
You haven't identified untreated at grade level in the rest of your model.
Okay.
The counterfactual, if I'm following correctly, is essentially, oh no, wait, you do have nearly and below.
Yeah.
All right, never mind, I walk back.
But what I was hearing was maybe this is assuming a stability of nearly and below across all four campuses. So there might be, more precision. And I know at some point we worried about like some campus distinction and estimated, I don't know if it was leave one out or affect separately by each campus. It's not well powered, but I'm pretty sure directionally is similar to what we report here.
that would be where the continuous baseline measure might help.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, like being below at one campus might mean something very different.
No, but that's a district-wide designation, but yeah.
No, but I mean, so what I'm saying is the below scoring kids in one campus have a very different mean score
Yeah.
than the below scoring kids. in
That's
the-
right. Yeah, gotcha. Okay, I'll check that because I'm pretty sure there's something like that in the appendix, but I'll have to double check. My recall is not that perfect. Okay, so quickly, balance looks good. I want to be mindful and do a time check. Yeah, I'm going to move a little quickly just so I can get through all the results. We've talked about sort of anecdotally what was going on with teacher assignment, the encouraging evidence from some of the teacher observables we've had, the robust results from the leave one out exercise. Changing, no one has pointed this out yet, but there's a big change in classroom peers. Like particularly if you're well below grade level, it's a pretty dramatic change. For the nearly at grade level, it's not so dramatic, but for below grade level students, their peers have baseline math achievement that's over a standard deviation higher, and a big change in other observables like fewer peers with economic disadvantage. So we went to the better identified literature on peer group effects, and it suggests those effects are fairly small. So if we were to take one of those estimates and apply them here, it suggests that the gain, for example, to this below grade level group from having peers that are this much better is actually pretty negligible, particularly relative to the effect size we have. So there's a kind of bounding logic here that suggests that peer group composition changes are not what's driving the test score change.
That's part of the program.
That's the other argument too, is that like it's part of the program, right? That they're with the better peers, right? But I guess I particularly want to sort of center the idea of the instruction too. Okay, now this bias is against the results we see. The remedial algebra readiness classes are actually a bit smaller too. So the kids assigned to the treatment have larger class sizes. Differential attrition is a potential concern here. So we run auxiliary ITT models. It's not plaguing our test score analysis. We don't see a significant effect in whether we observe a test score for the kid as a function of treatment, but we do see an effect showing up by 12th grade. Evidence of a 13, it's very noisy, but I believe, I forget the exact significance level, but statistically significant, 13 percentage point impact on the likelihood of still being enrolled in the district by 12th grade. And so I discussed this, and I do other work. I've got other research that looks at this issue of district retention as a function of assignment to culturally relevant pedagogy and sees similar effects. So I think there's something to the idea of kids feeling intellectually engaged in school and maybe parents seeing it, being more likely to stick around. It's not a dropout issue. And I want to stress, this is for kids assigned to the harder course that they're sticking around. So I think of this as kind of provocative. And again, it's exploratory, but some indication of engagement or revealed preferences that is uniquely relevant, I think, in the context of academic recovery from the pandemic. The idea of engaging instruction is a way to stop enrollment loss and keep kids around. Yes?
I'm trying to remember your samples. Is this for the specific sample of below grade level of which you have like 83 students?
Yes, and I think I've got a table I'll show you as I get to the results. So let me get to those, and then we could circle back. But again, with some caveat that at least by grade 12, we've got this potential attrition bias, probably a downward bias in terms of the benefits of the program. So we'll yeah.
You're looking for differential attrition, but what was the average attrition rate?
It's in the table. I don't think it's too high, but I want to say somewhere in the keeping 80 to 90% are students. So, okay, so I'm going to motivate you with just a little bit of data viz you might like. This is a Sankey graph where we've got this is focusing on that well below grade level group. This is the group randomly assigned to the Algebra Initiative class. This is the comparison group. So we could see none of these folks are in algebra. A bunch of them enter algebra. Some of these kids struggled as they moved to 10th grade. They had to take algebra again.
Can you orient this to the
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the colors, if you're not familiar with a Sankey graph, we've taken, it's like a flow chart for what's happening to the treatment group and the control group, at least for the first year, and we're going to follow them to 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So the treatment group is all in yellow, Algebra I. The control group is all in green, Algebra Readiness. So we follow the treatment group to 10th grade, and what do we see? Some tranche of them have to retake algebra, right? But, very few of them left the district. And of the 67, 32 have gone on to geometry. And a few leaked into some like vestigial integrated math course. For the Algebra Readiness, no one's in algebra, they start here. They move here, some leave the district right away, and a few leaked into integrated math. And of course, they haven't had algebra yet, so none of them go to geometry. Liz likes to use the metaphor of having at-bats at math, that one of the benefits of starting earlier with the right supports is you just get more opportunities to take the richer academic content. So let's go on to 11th grade before this graph gets impossible to read. So we start seeing now this group, a bunch of them start to go on to geometry. So this is mostly the comparison kids. And for this treatment group, some of them have to repeat geometry, but a bunch of them go on, and no one from the control group here is able to get to and through Algebra 2 in 11th grade. And again, this was a pathway that was, to a large extent, closed off from this group of students who were really well below grade level in 7th grade. And you could see that some of the district exit effects starting to grow for this group. And it gets harder to interpret in 12th grade. But I'm going to show you regression-adjusted versions of these course-taking patterns. So, but let's start with the confirmatory sorry, did that not come through? Yeah, okay. Yeah, these are the math scores. Okay, so we've got, these are the at grade level, these are the nearly at grade level, these are the below grade level. The blue line is the low item, 11 item 10th grade assessment. This line is for the grade 11 assessment in that basic specification without controls. It becomes quite a bit more precise and slightly bigger if we add the covariates. So we're seeing for this below grade level group, by 11th grade, their SBAC is roughly 0.2 higher, 0.19 to 0.2. So pretty substantial gain. There's also a somewhat smaller but similarly scaled gain in 11th or 10th grade that is marginally significant. So roughly 0.2, we consider that a large effect size for kids at this age, equivalent to roughly a year of learning. I want to say just a little bit about cost effectiveness. I know I'm going to run out of time. Ashley's going to give me a notification soon. But scaled by the cost of the initiative, we have calculations we walk through, consultant fees, teacher buyout time, et cetera. If we define it only for the below grade level student, so only those who clearly had test score gains here, this translates to about a 0.05 standard deviation test score gain for every $1,000 spent. I really like doing cost effectiveness calculations versus cost benefit because cost benefit can be so complex. All the myriad of benefits, there's so many, they're so hard to monetize. The costs have to be thought of too because there's a cost to raising taxes that generates deadweight loss. Cost effectiveness gives us a clearer answer to a simpler policy relevant question. Where's the most bang for the buck? And a nice benchmark here is the work Bo Jackson and others have done on the does money matter question. I think this is kind of interesting because their meta-analytic result, I think, says you get like 0.038 test score gain for 4 years of spending $1,000. I think the lead is buried on that result because that is really small. And almost everything we study seems cost effective relative to that general increase in spending. Any targeted initiative that is reasonably successful is likely to exceed that. I used to use Project STAR as the kind of, Cepheid variable, the standard candle against which we measure, things. But I think this is kind of useful. So anyway, big effects, noticeably directionally positive effects here, but statistically insignificant. At some level, this pleased the district administrators the most, right? Because it was like the parent outrage they were dealing with, and they were able to say, these kids might have been better off in this class, or at least there's no evidence they were harmed from this, which was politically really critical because they're now in this detracked class. So slightly larger impact for boys, but again, not pre-registered. They're accelerating through more math material. So if we go by grade 11, this middle line here is the Algebra II one that is particularly significant. Kids in the treatment condition, I got 5 minutes, more likely to take Algebra II. Some of the comparison kids catch up a little bit. It becomes less significant by 12th grade. I also want to underscore these like striking, again, not confirmatory, but interesting effects. For these below grade level kids, their absent rate fell dramatically. And let me stress this again. These are the kids randomly assigned to the more difficult course are showing up to school more. Now, to me, because of like some of the other work I've been doing on culturally relevant pedagogy, et cetera, my brain immediately starts thinking about social identity dynamics and belongingness in school and feeling worth there, et cetera, though some referees rightly pointed out to me, like, dial it down, Tom, okay? You're like, this is a reduced form result. You don't have any SEL mediators here, and they're right, okay? But an exploratory result that is suggestive of the way in which exposing kids to appropriately rich academic content can help reshape their sense of social identity and belongingness in schools. And so I think those kind of mechanisms are extraordinarily potent. Okay, and we know far too little about how to operationalize them. So also declines in measures of chronic absenteeism. And again, we've already mentioned by 12th grade, we see that students are more likely to remain in the district. So let me conclude quickly and then leave some space for more discussion and questions. So we see some evidence from this that the Algebra Initiative promoted college-ready math progression, some pretty substantial learning gains, improved attendance, district retention, among this very targeted tranche of some of the most educationally vulnerable students in the district. And as I've already suggested several times, these are all particularly relevant in the current context of academic recovery, in terms of math learning loss, the chronic absenteeism crisis, enrollment loss, with which many districts are struggling. Promoting engaging instruction is, maybe a strategy that cures all that ails you in that regard. And, I just want to underscore again, I sometimes wanted to style this paper as a tale of two math reforms. We've seen Algebra for All raise the floor by accelerating early access broadly. The SFUSD reform arguably lowered the ceiling by delaying early access for all. I think what's compelling about this is the idea of raising the floor, but doing it in a targeted way, and again, in this instructionally supported way, this mixture of higher expectations for grade 9 students coupled with teacher supports. So kind of proof point is all I could say for this. It's one district that, supporting, I think what's more generalizable about this though, potentially as a proof point, is this idea of the promise of supporting teacher capacity for instructional differentiation, maybe in other subjects as well. And in this context may help us relax this design trade-off I articulated that our reductive approach to the detracking debate has created. But I want to be real with you. This is something I know I've been in conversation with many of you about this today. This is one district and 4 high schools. So I want to be honest about the fact that I don't know if, this, well, I guess it was, pretty much at scale within this district, but can it replicate elsewhere? It's very much an open question. And if we can't figure out how to replicate it elsewhere, what are we doing? Right? What's the point of doing this kind of research if we can't do it again and again and again? And so I think this is a question with which we haven't struggled enough. I had an opportunity to think more deeply about this recently when I was given this opportunity to look into all the literature on continuous improvement in schools. So I really enjoyed writing this essay and doing a deep dive into the background of continuous improvement in business and health and now in education. And most of the time, including in business and health, these initiatives fail or they're done cosmetically. So I argue in this essay what we would need for a kind of hyper-local, problem-oriented guide to improvement, what we would need to realize that vision in schools. And it involves things like time for leadership to actually lead a change initiative, appropriate data systems, appropriate access to good evidence, and critically, we've been talking a lot about political economy, enduring institutional commitment to repeated cycles of innovation and assessment and improvement. If you're not familiar with this, idea of continuous improvement, it's generally built around PDS cycles, plan, do, study, act. Okay, so a lot of people embrace it. Very few people do it. Very few people do it, and even fewer do it well. So, okay. So, and again, I just see such a compelling need to better connect research findings to policy and practice at scale. And I'll conclude with one thought on thinking about connecting things to policy and practice on scale. 2 other things where I see real promise in math education that might be more scalable. One is Liz and I are doing some work now on the growing proliferation of so-called automatic enrollment policies. These are classic behavioral nudges, opt-out course assignment rules, where many districts and states have recently begun taking kids who score above a test score threshold and making the advanced course the next year their default course assignment. This is now state law in Texas. Virginia recently adopted it. And we're going to study that. You'll never guess what research design we're going to use to study the effect of this test score threshold. And interestingly, on the basis of the San Francisco results, they asked me to consult with them. In this current school year, they're reintroducing algebra to middle schools. And so they said, the question they put before our working group was, how can we do this in a value-aligned, equity-forward way? And so one of the things I suggested to them was this automatic enrollment. Like, make sure manifestly capable kids don't rely on whatever capriciousness exists in course assignment systems. Place them in the course. And again, I think part of the reason that can matter is the signal it sends to the kid about you belong here, right? I think that can be incredibly potent. So last thing I'll mention is I'm generally a skeptic of all things ed tech, a deep skeptic. But I think one of the few areas where ed tech has shown some promise is in computer-assisted instruction and math. So I think we're kind of underweighting that in how we think about academic recovery while we focus on more expensive, hard to implement, hard to scale solutions. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So how about if we take a couple of questions, Liz?
Yeah. So my question, I know there's like a fair amount of research on the impacts of like gender dynamics in classrooms, particularly in math ed. And I'm curious if being in the treatment group was associated with any meaningful shift in the like gender ratios of those classes that might be mediating any of these effects.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know off the top of my head what the gender composition of the class was. I did mention there were slightly larger effects for boys, and there were only 8 teachers in the classroom, so I should know what the gender balance of the teachers were. So I'll look into that. But
like the gender breakdown of the students.
I understand. Yes, of the students too. Yeah. So in general, like, boys underperform girls dramatically in reading, but it's much more equitable in math. So I wouldn't expect as much difference, but I'd have to check. Thank you.
I have 2 like small logistical questions. So the first one is like within the classes that for like the treatment groups, was it internally tracked? Like, was there any differentiation in the way that the students were like assessed per se? That's my first.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's one of the reasons I wanted to linger on the way in which they were doing instructional differentiation, because I don't think it had that quality. It had, remember that everything that was embedded in math language routines and teacher autonomy was about stressing, hey, you can all do this. Everyone in this room is capable. We expect to see you in geometry next year. We know this class is maybe difficult, but everyone here is capable of meeting these expectations. So that, coupled with that thoughtful design around the problem selection, and so every student was working on the same common math problem, right? So I think it was, and I see parallels to that, and again, with some of the other things I see in some of the culturally relevant pedagogy, where part of what people theorize makes them successful is building a community ethos within the classroom.
So Dan and then Alex.
Hi, Dan.
Every study has its threats to internal validity. The one that really is nagging is the small number of teachers and the selection of teachers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we were just discussing. I gather you discussed this in some of the earlier conversations today, but I can imagine an administrator saying, Tom's the guy who can handle this, I'll assign him. And if you don't know the process that went on when they were voluntold, there's a real risk of bias there.
Yeah, no, and there's only so much we could do, especially coming in ex post, because they did this like to address that. But I guess this is where I would particularly underscore one of the things I mentioned lightly earlier, which is the anecdotes from the administrators. It wasn't that teachers were queuing up, like, I've got plenty of time to do new things and want to try, et cetera, et cetera. That, they really had to sort of, have some administrators lean on teachers to do it. And they insisted it wasn't like picking the aces from the bullpen. And in the data available to us, we're not seeing that, but we'd love to be able to do the value-added calculation, which we can't do given all the data constraints and this test switching regimes.
But even if you had value-added afterwards, so not during this period, obviously, but currently.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, and there might be, but I think COVID's going to affect some of that, but there might,
The treatment.
Oh, because of the treatment.
No, that's a good point too.
I think the only thing that would be a problem for you is if a teacher was unconditionally better. Because if you had a situation where there's comparative advantage and the teachers who were assigned to the treatment group would have actually been worse if they were assigned to the control group, then in a sense the kind of like volume pooling could still increase allocative efficiency without, in a sense, like biasing upward your estimates.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. It's that the threat is not that they are better at, if these teachers are better at doing this, the threat is external validity, right? Not internal validity. If they are generically higher quality teachers, and I don't observe it, so, and that's, the reason I key on that is exactly the conversation I have when I'm discussing the ethnic studies research. With the value-added estimates, they don't appear to be generically better teachers, but there are a lot of indications they were very good at that course, right? Which they've been training in it for years. They were kind of very zealous, about teaching it, et cetera. And that's why I, pleaded with people to be, embrace the external validity concerns of that. But now that's a high school graduation requirement, California, so.
Alex, and then I think I know there were a couple of hands up, but I think, Alex, you're going to have to be the last one. Sorry.
Thank you so much. I have a question for you following up about the differentiation component, because it was interesting you just said all the questions were the same. So this is undifferentiated materials. And so I just wonder if you might reflect on or speculate, like, what was the piece of differentiation that was happening in these classrooms that...
Yeah. Yeah. So remember, though, that what was really key is the choice of that question. And I remember one of the examples. Remember, the basic comment was the questions were chosen with great intentionality to have the capacity to engage students who were approaching algebra from a much higher level and students who were less prepared in the class. And they would still find richness and ways to grow in their math knowledge with this particular type of question. And I'm trying to remember one example I remember coming across. It was like a math strategy game. And I didn't know the game, but there was some way in which the algebraic framing of a problem within a gaming situation created this kind of multiplicity of richness. And so I think that was part of the professional learning community, and the outside support was, hey, this month's problem, what's it going to be? And how are we going to create support kids who are approaching this problem at sort of higher levels and lower levels and create opportunities, I want to say zone of proximal development right now for some reason, for them to grow, right? So I think that was a key part of it, coupled with the teacher autonomy to be a little flexible with the pacing, not on the same highly, relatively prescriptive week-to-week schedule as the conventional algebra class.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you, Tom.
Thank you, guys.
And just as a reminder, as I said at the beginning, this is the last PIER seminar of the year, but we are taking suggestions for next year's invite. So if there are folks that you'd really like to see, either email me or Ashley Dixon, or even better, both of us, and we can put them on the list for doing our inviting this summer. So thank you.